and welcome to Lumina Foundation's State Policy Retreat. It's actually an annual retreat that we do every year. This year is our first virtual retreat, and so we're delighted that so many of you have joined us. We actually just put the invitation out. Within 24 hours of putting out the invitation, we already had over 300 of you join us, so thank you so much, and the count keeps going up. My name is Dominique Raymond, Domi for short. I'm a strategy director with Lumina Foundation. And our team really have been delighted to do convenings, but certainly now in the age of COVID, as we know, we've really moved to virtual. And in so doing, we've also created a tagline that we think really is important for all of you to think about. And it's really, how can we spark a shift in what it is that we are doing with our work? We're delighted to have all of you here that are part of state teams. States actually are a unit of analysis for us at Lumina, and we really understand the importance of state work as we work on learning after high school and how it leads to credentials and post-secondary attainment. I'm actually not your moderator for the entire retreat. You're in excellent hands with our state policy team, led by Scott Jenkins, our state policy director, and our colleagues, our state policy officers, Paula Santana and Amanda De La Rosa. Now, the key here is to navigate the retreat. It's essential that you, we think, that you take a look at the agenda. It's actually in the reception area on the left of your screen, but it's more than just the TikTok of the schedule. It actually gives you tips and tools on how to navigate this platform known as Hopin, to help you, take part in all of the events you want, to be aware of where everything is, to take part in all of the engagement things from polls to quizzes and the like. So take a look at the reception area, click, which is on the left-hand side, and there you'll find the agenda, and I'll consider it your agenda Sherpa for the state policy retreat. Again, delighted that you've joined us. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to hand it over to our colleagues. Thanks.
Good morning and welcome. I am Scott Jenkins, Strategy Director for State Policy at Lumina Foundation. It is with a lot of excitement and humility that we welcome you here today to our third annual State Policy Retreat. Last year at this time, we were gathered in San Francisco, and today we are at home or in the office working and living under a new way of life and are together remotely. As we embark on these next 2 days, I would ask that we all remember that we are living in a global pandemic that is remaking our lives, our professions, our families, neighbors, and friends every single day. I would also ask that you remember that this is not an equitable pandemic, and that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are being impacted at far greater rates than we should find tolerable. It is in that spirit that we kick off our time together, excited to join with you virtually, but understanding that there are millions of Americans that are not so fortunate and hundreds of thousands who have died. And while after 7 months, we may want to be done with this virus, it clearly is not done with us. We had discussed not having a retreat this year due to all the things that states are dealing with, but in conversations with our partners, you encouraged us to see if we could bring the magic of a Lumina State Policy Retreat to life online. As we planned for this day 8 weeks ago, we made the call that we would be happy if 5 states were able to make it here today. We are incredibly honored that we have over 20 state teams and nearly 500 individual registrants. Thank you for sharing your precious time with us. Without any further delay, let's jump into our first session. We're joined by Jamie Merisotis and members of the leadership team at Lumina. Jamie has been president and CEO of Lumina Foundation since 2008. He is an internationally known expert on talent development, higher education policy, and practice. I think of Jamie as the best kind of leader, a player coach who leads by doing and guiding and supporting the excellent team he has assembled at Lumina. I met Jamie very soon after coming to Governor Daniels' shop in 2009. We approached Lumina to help us create the first state campus of a small, virtual, relatively unknown competency-based university called Western Governors University, which now enrolls in excess of 100,000 students. Not many people know this, but Jamie actually came up with the name WGU Indiana. He immediately understood what expanding opportunity to adult post-traditional learners would mean to Indiana and to states. In this session, Jamie will provide remarks on his new book, Human Work in the Age of Smart Machines, and how the ideas and issues raised intersect and support Lumina's closing argument, our new strategic plan, by engaging in a conversation with members of Lumina's executive team. I will come back after that discussion to take questions from you for the panel. So please enter your questions in the chat function. Today, I would like to welcome Jamie to the stage.
I want to say a special thanks to you and your state policy colleagues at Lumina under the direction of your fearless and tireless leader, Danette Howard, for what I know will be an informative, provocative, and I think action-oriented state policy retreat. And more importantly, I want to join you in saying how delighted I am that so many of you from around the country are joining this important retreat. I'm looking forward to learning from all of you, strategizing with all of you, and ultimately working together to help complete the closing argument we've made in our new strategic plan, ensuring that Goal 2025 is met and that the nation's collective well-being is served. Now, as you've all seen in the plan, and I'm going to leave the bulk of the discussion about the plan to our fantastic panel of my Lumina executive team colleagues. As you've seen in the plan, we believe the 60% goal is within reach. Since we began our work to help catalyze the nation towards the goal in 2008, the share of adults 25 to 64 years old nationally with recognized quality degrees, certificates, or certifications has moved from about 38% to more than 51%. So all told, 12 million more U.S. adults have college degrees and other quality credentials than in 2008. We're very proud of that. And during the last 5 years, I think the most significant attainment increases have taken place because conditions set early on have begun to take root and are beginning to bear fruit. Now, the new plan has several guideposts, including a strong focus on short-term credentials and associate degrees, putting states at the center as the key drivers of the work, and publicly holding ourselves accountable at Lumina for the decades-long journey we've been on to put equity first in all that we do. You'll hear a lot more about these issues and more from my colleagues in just a few minutes. So I have two tasks this morning. The most important, as I said, is to help facilitate the discussion with Danette Howard, Chauncey Lennon, Courtney Brown, and Deborah Humphreys. To do that, however, I'd like to offer some setup comments on why this work is so important, and as Scott said, how my new book on human work may fit into the equation. Several people have asked me recently, so why did the president of Lumina Foundation write a book about human work, especially one that was released on the heels of the new plan? Well, many of you know that I've spent my life at the intersection of learning and work, trying to make both more inclusive, trying to make sure that both serve more and more diverse people, and generally making both better for individuals in society. But I think we in education are increasingly being asked a fundamental question. What is it for? Education for what? And my answer is simply that we have to prepare people for human work, the work that only humans can do. We know that work is changing in unprecedented ways as technology and automation and AI take over more of the tasks people used to do. We should be less fixated on what you see in almost the drumbeat of press that you read about the robot zombie apocalypse that's coming, and be more interested in the work that only humans can do in this age of smart machines. We know that machines are better at some things. They're better at repetition, at patterns, at speed, things that can be reduced to an algorithm. But machines can't understand subtlety or nuance or how people react in unpredictable ways. So the more interaction with humans, the less likely it can be done by machines. So I don't think work is going away, as some of those stories may suggest, but is transformed into the work of the future, human work, the work that only people can do. The human work blends human traits like compassion and empathy and ethics with our developed human capabilities like critical analysis and interpersonal communication, collaboration, and creativity. We're different than machines in many ways, but I think perhaps the most important is that for us as humans, ultimately work matters. People work not only because it helps them economically, people clearly need to make money, but also because it offers them social mobility and things like personal satisfaction, dignity, and ultimately meaning and purpose. So the connection to the post-high school learning system envisioned in the new strategic plan is, I think, obvious. We urgently need a large-scale, continuous system for developing and deploying quality learning that will prepare people for human work and life in this new age of smart machines. Combined with opportunities for serving others that enhance and magnify this learning, this new system will create a virtuous cycle of learning, earning, and serving others. Now, in the book, I talk about how human work requires wide learning, a sort of different way of thinking about learning than what machines do, which is deep learning, where they dig down deeper and deeper into algorithms. For humans, we do wide learning, a concept that includes the dimensions of time, of people, and of content. Now, the notion that learning has to take place in a wide time context over the course of people's entire lifetimes, I think is essential to human work. It is, as I said, a virtuous cycle that has to be repeated many times over a worker's life cycle, not simply once. The second dimension of wide learning is the people doing the learning. Human work has to serve a wide range of people, diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, immigration status, and a host of other factors. Human workers must reflect the totality of society for all of us to share in the benefits of their human work. And here I think the connection to the new plan is incredibly important because our Equity First commitment mandates that we ensure that the people who have been systematically denied opportunity in the current system receive the most urgent and priority focus in this work. And the third dimension, as I said, is the content of the learning. What people must learn to be successful in the human work ecosystem represents a wide array of human traits and capabilities. This concept of wide learning is connected closely to what we do that is uniquely human, which is to serve others. We serve others by applying those energies and interests to make our communities and the world better. So earning, learning, and serving make up human work. They're equally important. They happen together, and everyone has to have the opportunity to do them. We know that COVID has accelerated the coming change to human work. There's not going to be a back to normal, but rather we know a new reality ahead of us. But COVID has laid bare racial differences, not just in terms of the horrific death rates, but also by education and work. African Americans are more likely to work in essential occupations and fields where job loss has been highest, like hospitality. Work from home differences, I think, just underscore these issues about the intersection between race and education. More than 50% of BAs work from home, compared to less than 10% of those with high school credentials or less. And we know that the gaps in educational attainment between African Americans, Latinx, and Native American populations are stark compared to white Americans. So the key to the fulfillment of the system envisioned in our strategic plan is that educators need to question the assumptions behind our current systems. They have to put the student in the center of all that they do and focus on the success of all of their students. The fast-growing racial and ethnic groups and the students who are older, people who our system too often overlooks, are the human workers of tomorrow. Educators also have to make clear what students learn and make sure that it is clear to everyone. And they have to help students develop not just STEM and technical skills, but also their human traits and capabilities. So in the end, I think we have to answer the question, education for what, definitively and urgently. I believe preparing people for the world of human work is our shared responsibility, one that all of us must commit to in order to achieve the economic, the social, and the other benefits that result from this learning, earning, and serving model of the future. So let me now welcome my colleagues from Lumina Foundation, the people who I'm honored to work with every day in this work. Please join me in welcoming Danette Howard, our Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer, Deborah Humphreys, our Vice President of Strategic Impact, Courtney Brown, our Vice President of Impact and Planning, and Chauncey Lennon, our Vice President of Learning and Work. So we're going to jump right into this, and let me begin by asking Courtney the first question. Courtney, I mentioned the issues of the gap that we need to get to. We need 7 million more credentials beyond what we're currently on track to produce in order to hit goal 2025. So from a sort of mathematical or numerical sense, how do we get there?
Great question. Mathematically, it's pretty easy. I can run those numbers on a piece of paper. The challenge for us when we sat down to really think about this plan was, is it realistic and is it equitable? And so we had to really sit down and look at some of the numbers. And as you mentioned, Jamie, we're just over 51% right now, 51.3% to be exact. And we had to think about, all right, that's where we sit today with 2018 data. And knowing we need to get to 2025 in an equitable manner, 60%. And two things that we really had to think about. First of all, we had 2018 data, so we knew we had actually 7 more years of data to add to that, so 7 years to get there. And then we also need to think about, in 2025, individuals need to be 25 to 64. This is a really important point to think about, because those are not 17 or 18-year-olds today. And so one of the first things mathematically we had to think about are these are adults. These are not traditional age students that we really had to focus on and really thinking about adults. So if we had looked at the trends over the last 10 years, and if things progressed as they had been, we kind of averaged that and thought, all right, we're at 51.3% today. If those trends continue out to 2025, we'll be right about 56%. 56% is within spitting range of the 60%. And I think that was pretty exciting when we realized that. We realized this is 6.9 million. 6.9 million is a lot, but it seems within reach. And then when we started looking at the data and recognized the tens of millions of the some college no degree students out there, we thought about the 80 million adults with no recognized training or credential, it did become more possible. And then we realized, what types of credentials can these individuals actually get? And we put those into 3 buckets, as you spoke about, and as you can see in the strategic plan. Those are short-term credentials. That millions more, in fact, we believe that 2.6 million more over current trends can get short-term credentials by 2025. About 3.3 million associate degree holders, and that will be both short-term credential. That will be both the some college no degree and new adult enrollees. And then about 1 million more bachelor's degrees than will be produced if current trends continue. And again, with the some college no degree students, this is actually quite possible to achieve. So 6.9 million, again, mathematically on paper, really easy, but also it's realistic. And we've done it in an equitable way to ensure that we have targets we have equitable targets for both Black, Hispanic, and Native American students.
Perfect setup, I think, for where we need to go in terms of this work going forward. And I think for our retreat participants, I think the obvious follow-up question for all of you is: so what's Lumina going to do? What's the work that each of your teams are going to undertake in this final stretch to the goal? As you've all seen in our strategic plan, we have a detailed, aggressive approach to the work, and we thought we could spend a few minutes talking a little bit more about what the work will entail in each of these teams. So now let's begin with you. First of all, thank you for organizing the state policy retreat with your colleagues. What will your team be doing in order to help the nation get to the goal, for Lumina's efforts to catalyze the nation to help get to the goal?
Yeah. Thanks, Jamie, and thank you for giving me the credit for planning what's going to be a wonderful state policy retreat. But I really want to call out by name Scott Jenkins, our state policy director, whom you've already seen, and our wonderful state policy strategy officers, Amanda De La Rosa and Paola Santana, who you'll be able to see later today. So I have the real privilege of continuing to lead both our state policy work and our federal policy work at Lumina Foundation. And we are thinking about what we're going to be able to accomplish within states, of course, focusing on state policy, but there are other assets in states that we want to be able to leverage to help drive credential attainment. And so we are looking at the state more comprehensively. And so I will have the opportunity to lead that work as well. And as you mentioned, equity is going to be the primary anchor that supports all of our strategic work. And so at Lumina, we've taken on an equity first perspective and orientation, and that equity first work also lands in my area.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danette. And I think we're going to come back to the questions about equity first and what that means in a minute. But let me turn next to Chauncey. Chauncey, the plan sort of elevates in a way that is maybe deeper than what Lumina Foundation had done before, the role of community colleges and particularly the attainment of short-term credentials and associate degrees. Tell us a little bit about what your team is planning to do under this new plan.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. So I'd point out a couple additional contextual realities. So the first is that when we look at post-secondary education, we often don't remember that the majority of students are actually in either short-term credential programs or associate degree programs. And the majority of these students are both there because they're focused on occupational outcomes, or just in other words, just getting a better job. It's also important to remember that the majority of these students are students of color, right? So we're seeing how these issues come together in the short-term credential and associate degree arena. Now, we also know that in many respects, the community colleges who are serving these students, who are providing access to these credentials and degrees, are underperforming. There's much more they can do to promote attainment and promote equitable attainment. And so when we're thinking about what we're going to do, we're thinking about how we help community colleges do a better job of creating the kinds of short-term credential programs that lead to credentials of value, which in turn lead to good jobs. We're thinking about how community colleges can do more around communicating, getting information into the hands of students about the value of a post-secondary credential, and ensuring that onboarding, getting actually into programs, is much smoother than it currently is. And finally, we're thinking about student success. What are the ways in which we want to rethink institutions, redesign institutions so that they do a better job promoting persistence and completion?
Great. So that's a substantial body of work, and I think complements what Lumina has been doing in the last few years. But we are maintaining our focus clearly on bachelor's degrees, and particularly how to deliver those through regional institutions and minority serving institutions. Deborah, you and your team are leading that work. Can you talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, thank you so much. We are doing a kind of both and strategy. We know that lots of students are going to enter the system through the 2 years, but also through the 4 years. And we want to make sure that the whole system is designed in a way that everyone can succeed. So you mentioned minority serving and regional publics. We really want to work intensively with those institutions where we think particularly Black, Hispanic, and Native American students are likely to have access and have their entry points. So we have targeted that, and we want to work in a couple of different ways with those institutions. One, we know that all the people on this this session have been working for many years on evidence-based student success strategies. We have a lot of strategies. The question now is, how do we scale those strategies? How do we integrate them in terms of how institutions implement them? And I think most importantly, how can we make sure that the implementation and the design of those strategies are actually aligned to the needs of Black, Latin American, Black, Hispanic, and Native American students? And then I think the second thing that's really important is that population that Courtney mentioned, the adults with some credit and no degree. We believe there's a lot of work we can do to help institutions identify who those students are, communicate much more clearly with them what the pathway is for them to complete, and then change how we onboard them. Chauncey mentioned this as well. We need to onboard them into the institutions in ways where they can actually see their path clear to that bachelor's degree. And finally, we think we are going to have to redesign programs to make them more sort of working adult friendly. How can those programs be designed in such a way that working adults can really succeed in them? So those are sort of three of the big areas I think we're going to be working in.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. And so, we've got all of that work, and then we've got this ambition. And, Courtney, your task is both to help us understand how we're doing with our ambition, but also to help us think about how to course correct, how to change what we're doing with your focus on both impact and planning. What will your team be doing in the course of this new strategic plan?
Yeah, so a lot. And we know a lot. And I think my colleagues just spoke about some of the evidence-based practices that we know, and they're working to scale. But, our systems and our data still do not well represent today's students. They don't represent their journeys, and they certainly don't represent the types of credentials that are important to our economy today and tomorrow. We have to make sure we actually have the data to understand what's happening, so that we can understand the impact we're having and course correct where necessary. We have a lot to understand, as Chauncey mentioned, in that short-term credential space. Much of that work happening on the non-credit side of a community college. It's not well documented within systems, much less aggregated up to states and beyond. We need better data to understand high quality employment aligned credentials. What does that mean? How do we make sure that the credentials that people receive set them up for further learning opportunities, that set them up for employment, that lead to better jobs and better lives? And we definitely need to have better data to understand how that impact is on Native Americans and Hispanics and Blacks. And then, we do have a lot on evidence-based practices, but we still need more research specifically on adults, how they enter, why they enter, and what gets them to complete, so we can continue to course correct and scale these practices so millions more can continue to achieve these credentials and thrive.
Thank you very much, Courtney. And Danette, I think Courtney has underscored the sort of who we're really focusing on in this plan. And of course, you and I both mentioned in our comments about the fact that we've got an equity first approach in this new strategic plan. Can you talk a little more about why it's so important for us to have that equity first orientation in this work, and how we're maybe going to do some of the work beyond what we did in the last few years?
Sure. When we launched the last strategic plan, I think it was abundantly clear to us that if we were going to help the nation reach the goal, we couldn't just focus on overall attainment. We had to look closely and examine the significant and long-standing gaps in credential outcomes that existed between groups. Specifically, Black, Latino, and American Indian learners have outcomes that are between 20 and 30 percentage points below those of whites and Asians, depending upon what state we're examining. So we knew then that we had to develop an equity focus that looked specifically at racial equity. As we found ourselves in 2020, in the throes of the pandemic, and as I've heard others say, and I've repeated, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. We saw the inequities that exist in our nation exacerbated. And then with the killing of George Floyd and the resounding calls for racial justice, at Lumina, we knew that we wanted to do more than simply issue another statement. And so Equity First was born out of that reality. And for us, Equity First is about both racial equity, which we define as being achieved when outcomes cannot be predicted by race, and specifically when outcomes and credential attainment cannot be predicted by race. That's when we will know that racial equity has been achieved. But it's important for us not just to stop with a focus on equity, but to also underscore justice, which we have defined as the dismantling of systemic racism. So all of our work at Lumina will take an equity first approach. That means all of the strategy work that you've just heard about are focused on short-term credentials, associate degree completion, and baccalaureate degree completion. But what is very exciting and I think different about what we're doing, Jamie, is that that commitment doesn't only stop, begin, and end with our strategy work. We're looking at what equity means in our operations, in our finance, in our investments, what that means for our legal work, what that means for our board's commitment, and importantly, what that means for the partners that we choose to work with and the work that we support them to do and do right alongside with them. So it's very exciting. We take this work very seriously, and we are also inviting all of our partners, including our state policy colleagues, to hold us accountable for these commitments that we've made.
Yeah, well said. And I think it's going to be really important for us to do this together with our colleagues in the states and ensure that as we all strive to put equity first, that we learn from each other, that we benefit from each other's experiences. Let me stay with you for a second here, Danette, and just ask you a little more about this issue of states and the role of states in this work. So, Chauncey and Deborah, you, Courtney, have all talked about the work, about the strategic work that we're doing. In the strategic plan, we situate states as the driver of the work. So what does that mean in practice, and why is it the driving force behind the strategic plan?
Yes. And I think one of the best predictors of future performance is a past performance. And we know at Lumina, we have had a great deal of success in working collaboratively with our state policy partners to support credential attainment in the states. So, for example, when we first started this work on the goal back in 2008, there was only one state that had a statewide goal. And now we've worked very closely with our partners and are so pleased that 44 states have developed statewide specific goals. So we want to build upon the success that we've seen and help to support in states and in state policy by identifying all of the various stakeholders and assets in a state that can come together to support credential attainment. And that's what we mean by states as the driver, Jamie. Of course, are going to continue our focus on state policy, and we will have a state policy agenda that will drive all of that work. But how can we bring together the great work that is happening in states at community colleges and align that to the work that's happening with state policy? How can we identify states where there is incredible work happening on the baccalaureate completion front in some of our regional comprehensive public institutions and MSIs, including HBCUs? And how can we align that with state policy, really to have a concentrated effort on increasing outcomes for our learner? And we think that that's going to result in some very important wins for our students in terms of them being able to earn the credentials that they need to lead the kinds of lives that they want to have.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up maybe, which is that work that you've underscored, I think is so important. And of course, we've long worked in federal policy as well at Lumina. And I'm curious to know, and maybe to reflect for our colleagues that are part of this retreat, is this a particularly right moment to finally make progress towards a real federal-state partnership?
We're very optimistic, Jamie. We've been talking about this for many years at Lumina. But we think that with the role that federal policy has played as of late with providing support to states and then institutions through the CARES Act, that this is an incredibly right moment to build upon that as we continue to think about what our institutions, our public institutions within states, are going to need in terms of resources and support. We do think it's time to be very intentional about building upon some of the federal state partnership models that we've seen in the past to introduce one that is right for this moment in time. So that's definitely where our attention is, as well as we think about the linkage between our federal policy and our state policy work.
I mean, it seems like an important opportunity for a sort of 1-2 punch, a chance to actually help power us through to the goal by actually taking advantage of the new emerging opportunities that may exist in federal state policy. So I really appreciate your point there, Danette. Thank you. So
Absolutely.
let me turn next to Chauncey and Deborah, and ask both of you. So, in the new plan, we're focusing, as you both pointed out, a lot of the work on community and technical colleges and four-year institutions. Many of the people participating in this retreat come from varying perspectives. Some might be in SHIO agencies, some might be institutional leaders. How can SHIOs and institutional leaders work together to ensure that we improve the outcomes for our Black, Hispanic, and Native American learners as we are trying to double down here on Goal 2025? Chauncey?
Sure. Well, I would start by saying, we need, sort of to Courtney's point, we need greater insight in exactly what's happening in the short-term credential space as it relates to outcomes for students of color. For some states have made progress, but in general, because we're not doing a good job tracking, certainly certification attainment, but also often on certificates, we don't have a good sense of where we're succeeding and where we're failing. And perhaps, just as importantly, we don't then see how certain choices in the kinds of industries we're investing in, the kinds of occupations we're creating programs for, can better serve those who often hit post-secondary with the greatest disadvantage. We need to think about the role that community colleges can play, the role that short-term credentials can play in terms of getting people the kinds of skills they need to have successful careers in the context of the ways in which economic change, so the economic chaos we're living through right now, is really upending different sectors. Those sectors have a kind of a different racial and profiles. And so we got to think about all this in the context of how our investments in creating new kinds of programs can speak to the kinds of economic inequities we're seeing around us.
Thanks, Chauncey. And Deborah, what's your cut on this?
So I think there's a couple of key ways in which SHIOs in particular and state leaders can play a really constructive role in addressing two goals that my colleagues have already talked about that are interrelated. So we obviously have really important goals about closing equity gaps and increasing completion rates for students. And we also want to reduce over time the number of that 36 million people out there who didn't make it to the finish line, right? And who have credits but no degree. So one part of the reducing of that numbers is bringing them back. But another part of reducing the number is not creating more of them, right? How do we make sure that we are getting more students to the finish line? And I think there's sort of 3 or 4 ways that I think SHIOs in particular can play a really constructive role. The first is about data, that they can really ensure that institutions are collecting and using data, disaggregated data, to understand exactly which students are succeeding where in their institutions. So we need to look at that data not only institutionally, but program by program, so that you can really see where success is happening and where there are areas for improvement. But I also think SHIOs can take that data and bring people together in groups to understand how to take the data and make it actionable. So SHIOs can play a really important role in bringing together institutional researchers, registrars, advisors, department chairs, all of the people who need to look at the data and figure out what role they need to play. I think another area where we're seeing with some of our state partners some real exciting sort of frontier issues on data is also important. We need to have a better sense not only of what the students who are already in the system are doing, how are they succeeding, but also what happens to them after they graduate. What are the employment outcomes for different programs, and how do we take that information and feed it back into programs so that they can improve? So number one area is data. The second is, we mentioned before, there are all of these student success interventions out there, and a lot of people are implementing them. But what we can do is bring together institutions across a state to learn from one another how to design and implement specifically with those equity goals in mind, because we're not always doing that, and they can learn from one another. I think SHIOs also have a really important role to play in helping institutions identify those adults who have credits, who are very close to the finish line, and then help institutions figure out how do we get those students back into the system, either at the institution they started at or maybe at other institutions in the system where they could easily finish. And then the final thing that I would say that I would really urge state leaders to embrace as a role is setting a vision for the goals that you have around equity and for your vision of what quality means. What are those credentials that we're really trying to scale up, and how aligned are they with that human work that you've been talking about? States can play a really important role in sort of defining what that landscape looks like. Here's what the human work is we're trying to prepare our students for, and here's how our institutions, how we are supporting our institutions to design programs specifically with that outcome in mind.
So, Deborah, I have to ask, with the approaches and strategies that you've described here, I think what you're talking about is working as deeply as we can and as quickly as we can with the existing systems, state leaders, institutional leaders working together. But I think it's fair to ask the question, what's the balance between working within those existing systems in order to get to the goal and, frankly, actually breaking apart the systems that don't serve people particularly well?
Yeah, I don't know that I think about this in the same way that a lot of other people do. I feel like it's probably not as constructive to think about it as the current system, completely new system, because it seems to me that, one, we have enormous potential to work within our systems and reform the practices that we have been traditionally doing just because we've always done them that way. So I think there's enormous progress we can make in the existing systems. But I also think that when we look at some of what we've invested in the past few years, a lot of innovation and sort of disruption, it isn't necessarily always happening outside of institutions. It's happening sometimes in little islands within institutions. So even some very traditional institutions, but you don't always see it that way. So you think about competency-based education, it's not just new institutions like Western Governors that's doing that. You have actually traditional systems, the University of Wisconsin system and others, who've said, yeah, we need to serve our students better. We need to serve returning adult students better. And we actually can build it internally. We can build a competency-based system that creates, in effect, new pathways through the existing system. So I don't tend to think of the disruption sort of landscape in that way. I do think that our institutions really are going to have to do some pretty radical redesign of programs, but I think they can do it with the systems they currently have.
Yeah, I mean, your example of competency-based learning, I think, is a great example of a sort of inside-outside approach to trying to get to the change that we're looking for. Chauncey, how do you think about this inside-outside approach?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think in some respects we appreciate how agile some of our systems are. We think of them as fairly rigid. But when you look at some of the most innovative community college systems and community colleges, you're really seeing a kind of melding of the non-credit and credit sides of the house. There's a kind of recognition that kind of distinction hasn't really served us well. And obviously, in the wake of COVID, as we have to focus on upskilling millions more adults, it's not going to serve us to sort of address that challenge. And so you are seeing the system move in some ways rapidly to a world in which credentials are more stackable. There's greater transparency about credential value. The system is responding in the ways we would hope it to be. That said, I think there are other ways in which there's a lot of rigidity. And in there, I think one important thing to keep our eye on, of course, is the rise of other kinds of credential providers, be they for-profits or other kinds of entities. And how that dynamic actually, I think, is a kind of positive kind of pressure, which is making systems recognize that if they don't respond, other folks will come in, other providers will come into this space. And so I think the real challenge here is in some ways to step back and look at the larger kind of statutory, regulatory, and financing context and ask ourselves, how do we approach these in ways that will allow for greater agility? How do we create institutions that are better able to respond and adapt to the kind of realities of the economy we're operating in?
Thanks, Chauncey. Courtney, I want to sort of follow up with you now on thinking. Chauncey mentioned this issue of sort of large scale change, and frankly, the context within which all of this change is happening is pretty extraordinary. I mean, we're clearly living in uncertain times. That may be the understatement of the millennium. But we've got a presidential election looming in less than 2 weeks. We have long overdue racial reckoning and calls for systemic reform. We've got an unprecedented global health crisis, and we've got a deep economic recession marked by, as I mentioned in my opening comments, tragically high unemployment rates and frankly worsening impacts for our Black, Hispanic, Native American, and low-income communities. So how does Lumina situate the opportunity for change amid all of that disruption and chaos we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think that's the understatement of the century. Uncertain times. We're pretty scary times, But it's not the first time that we, as a nation, that higher ed has faced major crises. Higher ed's faced wars, natural catastrophes, social unrest, financial downturns, and with pretty much frequency. But this one is different. And I don't think ever before this have the strength of colleges and universities across the board, from the most elite to the least elite, been tested as much as they have been over the last 7 months. And on top of that, the health crisis and the increasing gaps between the haves and the have-nots are really just further exacerbating the ability for more students, especially students of color and low-income students, to have access and succeed in higher education. We're seeing this in the declining enrollment trends for the fall. So this is definitely worrisome for Lumina and really for all of our partners joining us today. But I would also argue that we have this unique opportunity. And if we act now with intention, I honestly believe we could come out stronger with a much more talented workforce than where we were even a year ago. But I think the main priority is no longer to find ways of coping with the short-term effects of COVID, or, wishing if I just turn the TV off, I won't see the social or political unrest that's happening. We have to stop placing Band-Aids on these gushing wounds, or even just simply biding our time until a vaccine is developed. Instead, we really have to think carefully. And we've tried to do some of this with our strategic plan, but we need all the partners and everyone to kind of think through us on how we can reshape higher education for long-term resilience and begin the change immediately. Institutions are naturally going to want to go back to normal, as we all are. We're all kind of craving that time, even 9 months ago, where we could even just sit in the same room together through a long, boring meeting. But that would be at the detriment of our system and the students we should be serving. We have to recognize there's no going back to normal or what was. And, it's interesting because even, the time I've almost been at Lumina for 10 years, and we've talked about, the field's been talking about this disruptive change coming to higher ed for a long time, but we're not moving fast enough on it. And this is even more true right now. Like, the pandemic and the calls for social justice are more immediately questioning our outdated, expensive, elitist higher education model. And it's leaving more people out with the systems that we have in place. The pandemic's further exposed these socioeconomic inequalities and perpetuating these glaring gaps among Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans and their access, success, and attainment of post-secondary credentials. So I actually believe that this exposure and this current bright light on these inequities and the calls for fairness will gain some much needed traction and sustainability. We've already heard it with many of our state partners out there that are really doubling down and focusing on addressing the root causes and the systemic inequities that exist in their higher education systems. But again, if we just wait and think, we're going to wait until we get back to normal, or put another Band-Aid on the outcome, not the root cause, then we're not only not going to reach goal 2025, but we're going to continue to increase these disparities between the haves and have-nots. So, Lumina, with this closing argument on the goal, is calling for the changes immediately and at scale. And so I think while we're in these uncertain and really scary times, I have to be optimistic that they are a turning point for our nation and for our higher education system to really accelerate the changes that we all need.
Thanks, Courtney. And I think, your point about the old normal, and in several of my book talks in the last couple of weeks since the book came out, people have raised this question. They've essentially said the old normal wasn't so great for a lot of people. And so what we need is a different normal, a normal that is actually more focused on the people who have faced many decades of systemic bias in the existing system. So we're going to end with a closing question for all of the panelists. I want to remind all of you to use the chat to pose your questions. We'll welcome Scott Jenkins back into the fold here in just a few minutes. But I maybe want to end on this point that you underscored here, which is this issue of the large-scale change that's required. And again, we've focused on adults of color on these populations over the course of many years. It's not new, but I'd love to hear from all of you some thoughts about what we've learned from what we've done before, from that previous work, and how that is informing this next phase of work. And so we'll just go around the horn here. We can start with Danette.
Yeah, I think this is a great question for us to end on, because we've been thinking about and conducting research on adult learners and learners of color for many years. And I remember that when these conversations first started happening, people would refer to returning adult students as low-hanging fruit, as if they were the easiest to re-enroll and to get across the finish line. And what we know now is that that just is not true. It is hard, because these are students who bought into the narrative that higher education would make a difference for them in their lives, and then they tried it and were unsuccessful. So we have to reconvince them that if they come back, this time will be different, and that they will earn the credentials that they seek. So I think that's the first thing that we've learned. And so we have to think about what options and alternatives do we need to offer to adult students who are considering coming back and getting those credentials. We heard Deborah say that they may want to return to their original institution. And so what has changed to ensure that they are able to have a successful pathway? But then how do we make the system work better for the student so that they can take that previous learning and apply it perhaps in a different setting, a different institution, a different program, or a different environment? I think we also have to continue to be very intentional about the lived experiences of our adult students. We know that nearly 26% of all college students are parents themselves. So what kinds of supports do we need to make sure are available for parents who are trying to learn and earn those post-secondary credentials at the same time? We also know that many of our students are working, and in fact working full-time. So what sorts of opportunities, programs can we offer to our students to ensure that they're able to successfully cross the graduation stage? And then finally, as we think about credentialing opportunities, we've spoken a lot today about the short-term credential pathways, but how might we embed those short-term credentials into associate degree and bachelor's degree pathways and opportunities, such that if our adult learners want to start with a short-term credential so that they can get completion in a relatively short period of time, how can we make sure that that is their first step, but not their last if they want to continue on? So really embedding them into the degree pathways is another thing that we'll be working on at Lumina over the next few years.
Thank you, Danette. That's exactly right. And Chauncey, I think what Danette's talking about is front and center in terms of the work that you're leading at Lumina. What's your cut on this?
So I would say there's kind of at least two levels to think about here. One is I think we've learned that actually the category maybe is too broad, right? There's not one kind of adult learner, right? We have to sort of understand that we need to move to a place where we can understand, the adult who has got, a couple $100s of parking tickets that's preventing them from going back to completing is a very different adult than the adult who started, ended very quickly, maybe has debt, really has a kind of sees the institution they were at as a real, one of the worst experiences they've had, and many, many other types of experiences in between. So we need to, in some ways, do a better job thinking about the different experiences adults are having and sort of think about how we respond to those specific sets of needs and experiences. I think on another level, though, we have to really understand that some of the research we've been doing on what motivates people to go back tells us a very clear story, which is that it really is about a job and a career and improving the current job people have. And if we don't speak to that, the kind of motivation, and we don't sort of help people understand that there is a system out there that's affordable, that's flexible, that's career-oriented, we're not going to do a good job of convincing folks that it's worth coming back to get a credential.
Yeah, thank you. And this sort of theme of pathways that Danette and you are talking about, Deborah, it's obviously important to continue that work. Correctly, this is a sort of part of that virtuous cycle I was talking about in my remarks. Correct?
Yeah, I think that we have learned a lot about sort of thinking about reforms and implementation of student success strategies in the context of these pathways that students are on, the ones they're actually on, not the ones we built the system assuming they would be on, right? So that builds on what Danette was saying. I think the other things that we've learned in some of the works that we've invested in most recently, we invested in about 9 states to up the ante on the state role in assuring quality. And one of the things that I've been really struck by in those projects has been that we really can change the conversation about what we're doing if you talk about more equitable access to quality and you bring together quality and equity with actual data on how our students are doing. And I've been really impressed with the states that have been working on that. They really are sort of changing the conversation about on the campuses in terms of what our obligations are to students and what does it mean to have a commitment to quality and equity. So I think we've learned a lot there and are continuing to learn. I think the other thing that we've learned a lot goes back to something that Danette mentioned earlier. One of the ways in which we think about this equity first concept is we know that there are a lot of student interventions that work for student success. But the design of them and the implementation of them, if you're not thinking about equity as you are designing them and as you are actually rolling them out, you run the risk of improving success, but not in an equitable way. So I think that we've learned quite a bit about how you have to think not only about the intervention or the specific strategy, but how you actually roll it out for your students and in your institutions. And I think the final thing I would say is that I would echo something that Courtney said about how this moment is a moment where we can kind of lean into a restructuring that really will build a more resilient kind of system. And, we have seen the ability of institutions and programs and faculty and students to actually pivot and really, deploy technology in ways that they may have been hesitant to do before or skeptical about. So I think that we have an environment here where we've learned we can do that and we can do it faster than we might have thought before. And the challenge now is, as Courtney said, is we need to kind of go big and lean into that rather than just sort of putting a pause on it and saying, let's wait and see what happens.
Right, exactly. And let me just bring Courtney back in one more time here, because Courtney, you've obviously been on point in helping us to understand what we've learned from what we've done before and how it's informing this work going forward. What do you want to add to this conversation?
So I echo everything my colleagues said. The problem with going last is I want to say yes, yes, yes on all of those. The only thing I would add is maybe from our process and what Lumina is doing. And I think each of them touched on this a little bit, but learning from our partners. They're the ones that are out there doing this work, and listening to them and taking that information in is always important, and we continue to learn from that. And the last thing I would say to just kind of end on is that we also have learned we need to be intentional about our commitment to equity, and not be apologetic or sugarcoat it. That we are about better outcomes for Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans, and we expect to see impact and outcomes for them in all of our work, rather than just say for all students. And I think that's one thing that we have learned, that intentionality. And as Deborah said, from the beginning, baking that in is really important. So I think that's one of the most important things we've learned, and it's clear in our new strategic plan, and then the way we're approaching it through Equity First.
That's fantastic. And maybe just to bring it back to the top here as we move into our questions from our colleagues participating in the retreat here is, one of the things that you see in the strategic plan is both a sort of intense focus and a commitment, a belief that we will achieve the goal in 2025, and a concerted focus on making sure that we can do all that we can to help catalyze the country towards the goal. But we also acknowledge that the demand for talent is going to continue, of course, beyond 2025. 2025 isn't a cliff. It's really a milestone on a longer journey. So even when the country achieves a 60% goal, we know there's going to be a lot of important work to do. And as I said in my opening comments, I think a lot of that is going to have to focus on making sure that an increasing share of adults with education after high school can get a satisfactory answer to the question, education for what? So I think that we're going to have to work with others to help articulate, what the learning that the various credentials people receive actually represents in this emerging talent economy, and how these redesigned learning systems after high school are going to help strengthen the nation. So, part of our task at Lumina is not only to make sure that we help catalyze the country towards the goal, but also to develop new ideas and strategies for sort of seizing on those opportunities of our time and overcoming challenges. And so, we're going to have to invest in innovation and discovery. We talk in the strategic plan about doing that in the context of an innovation and discovery laboratory, where we can help to develop some of the building blocks for this new learning system that's going to prepare people for that human work in this increasingly complex and technology-mediated society. So, at the end of the day, I think what this is all about is a continuing journey, not one that ends in 2025, about building a better educated country that means stronger individuals, a stronger society, and as our ongoing work has said for the last decade, a stronger nation. So I think that's what's at stake in terms of the work here today. So now let me welcome back Scott Jenkins to the fold. Scott's been monitoring the questions, and we'll take some of your questions and comments. I want to thank my colleagues from the executive team as we move into this Q&A part of the conversation for their extraordinary work. And I want to add that our colleagues on the executive team, Tim Robinson, Brad Kelsheimer, and Holly McKiernan, are all very much equally engaged in this work and committed to the efforts that we're talking about here now and going forward. So, Scott, let's jump into some of the questions.
Fantastic, Jamie. Thank you. Thank you for a great conversation. I think everyone now realizes why I always say that I've got the best job at Lumina, getting to work with you all. We have a lot of questions that have come across the transom. We're going to start with Danette Howard. We've got a question from Melanie. How does Lumina's Equity First agenda not only ensure more individuals cross the finish line in earning any kind of post-secondary credential, but also promotes an equitable distribution of attainment by education level, i.e. addressing the BA differential between white and Black populations? Danette?
Melanie, thank you very much for that question. This is something that my colleagues and I think a lot about. This is something that I personally think quite a bit about and try to remind us as we are doing our planning. So there are a number of guiding principles that undergird our strategic work and specifically our equity first work. And one of them is that when we speak about equity, we speak about quality at the same time. So the twin pillars of what we are focusing on are both equity and a quality educational experience for every single learner. One of the principles that guided this work as we've been developing it over the year is that we will not in any way reinforce a two-tiered system where some learners get access to the very best of everything in terms of an educational experience and opportunity, and others get what remains after that. And so that is kind of baked into the way that we are thinking about the work and the way that we will continue developing the work. As I said earlier, while we do have this very important focus on short-term credential attainment, and we think that for many students, that is the first most important step on their educational journey, we don't expect that for any student that has to be the final step. And so how can we do what we've been talking about in higher education for a very long time? Like, how can we meaningfully support the stacking of credentials or embedding of the shorter term credentials into a pathway that leads toward a bachelor's degree, so that if someone wants to first attempt the bachelor's degree, along the way, they will earn that certificate. They will earn that associate's degree. And so those will be important kind of benchmarks along their educational journey. So this also goes back, Melanie, to what I said earlier about us wanting to work in partnership with all of you, and for us asking you to hold us accountable to these commitments. We expect that you will see as we develop our work plans and roll out the work associated with this new strategic plan, how we are operationalizing everything that I've just said. So we look for you to give us the thumbs up if we're doing this right, or if you think we're going off course or not honoring this commitment, let us know so that we can work with you to do better.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Danette. Next question is for Chauncey. Chauncey, this comes from Jacob. Short-term credentials are a small percentage of the whole of all credentials conferred by community colleges. Do you have a sense for the ideal blend between short-term credentials and associate degrees at the national level and by state?
Well, it's a great question, and I wish we had a better answer. I think the challenge here is both understanding, where we are right now, understanding what a more optimal outcome would be, and as we've been talking about, really understanding how it is short-term credentials can fit into a larger pathway. There, some of the complexity has to do with the fact that credentials, short-term credentials, certificates, certifications, they can operate in very different ways. Different industries, those credentials mean different things, and they're sometimes part of the actual structure, a sort of upward movement. Sometimes they're more of a ticket to entry. And so we have to really appreciate a kind of variation by industry, variation by region of the country. They all don't mean the same thing. Their employers don't use them in the same ways. So, we need to, in some ways, deepen our intelligence about credentials, about who credentials are serving best, right? It's not always, we don't always see the same returns to credentials. And we look at different racial and ethnic groups, gender. I think this is really, we see this as really the beginning of a much longer process in which we appreciate the power of short-term credentials, but we have to sort of build a world in which those credentials are equitable and part of a larger credentialing system.
Thank you, Chauncey. So for our third question, I'm going to offer it to Courtney first, but because we've done so much work in this area across the foundation, I'd love for, if any of you all want to chime in, just give me a hand sign and jump in. But the third question, Courtney, comes from James. Concerning adult learners, what are the best strategies to keep student momentum when the student can only attend part-time?
Great question, James. And so this is really important, whether the student attends part-time or full-time or intermittently throughout a few years. I think one of the most important things is to think about comprehensive support and ensure that that student has their questions answered. So it's not just academic support, but do they have the childcare they need? Do they have the emotional support that they need? All of those things, and thinking about that. And I know both Chauncey and Deborah's teams are thinking about these comprehensive supports for adult learners. And Danette spoke about some of these also. Also, to understand that adults do not attend how we measure them. They don't attend, we measure persistence from first year to second year, fall enrollment, and adults participate in different ways. And so to change some of those expectations and continue to monitor and reach out to those students, I think is really essential. And the other thing I would add is the employment piece is important. The extent to which their employer can be a cheerleader or a help, or there's an employer mentor there for that student, I think is important. And as Chauncey spoke, we know that adults are most likely to complete if they know there's a job or a promotion on the other end. And so in continuing to make those connections between employment and that credential is essential.
Scott,
Thanks a lot, Deborah.
I agree completely with Courtney's analysis there. I think the other thing that we don't do very well but could do better is how we advise and stay in touch with students, whether they are full-time, part-time, or stopped out. We have to somehow create a system where students really feel that they belong in the institution, even if they are coming in and out of it. And we don't do that very well because we still have a system of sort of credit accumulation and advising that is still assuming the student is there and that is making a kind of progress because we designed the system assuming they could just come in and keep going. They're not. So how do we continue to help students? This is a very sort of human work thing, Jamie, right? How do we keep engaged with the student so that they feel like, no, we still want you to finish and we believe you can finish, even if you are not on the path that looks the same as everybody else's. And not sure it's sort of more of a mindset change than a system change, but it feels like we have to get there for both faculty members and advisors to think differently about the journey that students are on.
Great point, Deborah. Chauncey, you were jumping in?
Sure. So, this is sort of another way to say the points that I think both Courtney and Deborah have made. But, the system is designed right now to create the greatest risk for part-time students, basically, right? Those are the ones who are, given the way the system works, are the least likely to complete. And so I think we need to think about what are the different ways in which we can take some of that risk out, right? One of them has been the efforts around credentialing as you go. If you're going to take longer because you're part-time, then we really need to design a system that really gets you a credential as quickly as possible. Even if your goal is a kind of longer-term credential, how do we create systems so that part-time students will find themselves with some kind of credential as quickly as possible, given the longer time frame they're kind of committing to because of their part-time status?
That's perfect. That actually feeds into the next question, which is directed at Deborah, and this is from Catherine. The short-term credentials are a challenge for faculty who teach credit courses. Often the credential is viewed as a competition and not seen as a path to more education for any student. How do you suggest overcoming this problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Catherine, and we've talked about it as a team. I think that while it's a challenge for people to think about this, I do sort of feel like at this moment we're at a tipping point of understanding about this. It's all about transparency about what those credentials actually represent and how they can actually help students. And again, it's a sort of mindset of what the journey is that the student is on that is actually realistic for the student that we're actually trying to get there. But we do have to keep in mind two things. One, we have to ensure that students can see the way forward and not assume that some students will have to stop at the short-term credential and others will keep going. That we have to assume everybody, if we build the system the way it needs to be, can get there. And I think if we start from that, it'll be a lot easier to get faculty to think about these things as, in effect, new tools. They're like curricular tools, right? If you just think about faculty members sitting around figuring out, we do this and then we do that and then we do that, and that's a coherent plan. this is one component of a coherent plan that can actually improve the quality of the outcomes, not compete with the ability of someone to get the bachelor's degree, but actually potentially have them get a bachelor's degree that is even more powerful and even higher quality. So it's all about the framing of what we're trying to do. We're not trying to peel away a student, but instead we're trying to accelerate that student's pathway, recognizing what the student's real environment is and what their needs are.
Great point. Our next question. Chauncey, go ahead.
I would just add one other point there. I couldn't agree more with what Deborah had to say, but I think, part of what contributes to this dynamic is, there's a lot of sort of talk out there about, the declining value of the BA, or the BA doesn't matter, employers don't value the BA. That's just not right? And so I think, you can imagine a world in which, we seem to be partly in a world in which there's a kind of BA versus short-term credential thing happening. And I think we all need to sort of push back and recognize that we need more of both. And we need a system which is about, AA transfer degrees to BAs, and a system is about, the short-term credential pathways. Both of those need to be robust. And the system isn't zero sum at the level of BA versus a short-term credential. And, work with faculty to sort of have them appreciate that the post-secondary system gets stronger the more we have these robust pathways.
That's really helpful. Thanks a lot. Okay, so our fifth question, this one's for Danette, and we talk about this all the time, Danette. So I think it'll be good for us to share this with our colleagues out in the field. And it comes from Nick. Is Lumina taking a position on the nature and design of state post-secondary completion or attainment plans and or student success agendas? Or does the foundation defer to states to design and execute those plans?
Yes and yes, Nick. So yes to both parts of that question, and let me try to explain why. I mentioned earlier that 44 states had developed statewide attainment goals, and those were goals that the states felt best fit their needs. So we didn't dictate what a state's goal should be, but that they should have one and that should have some key elements included in it. That's the same approach that we take with states having plans. We think that a state has to have a plan that will help them achieve those very ambitious goals, and that plan should include certain design elements. But we don't dictate to a state exactly the specifics that have to be included in the plan. So, for example, we believe that every state has to focus on addressing its equity gaps. So essentially, every state needs to have an equity first plan. And we can provide some advice and guidance on what should include it in that equity first plan. We also think that there has been an incredible amount of research on student success over the years. So we know what works to get all learners, but specifically adult learners of color, to the credentials that they need, and that those success strategies should be embedded in the plan. We also think that the institutions in a state where those students are most likely to be enrolled, so our community colleges and our regional public comprehensive institutions and MSIs, need to be prioritized in terms of funding and resources in a statewide strategy for completion and attainment. So all of those things we think need to be visible in the plan and included in the plan. But again, how the state goes about achieving the outcomes associated with those elements, we leave up to the state.
Thank you, Danette. So our final question, Jamie, is to you, and we expect you to take it home on this one. So this comes from Greg, and Greg asks, with higher education being viewed increasingly through a political prism, how can we unite the country around the big goal, or Goal 2025, in a way that speaks to both Democrats and Republicans, and also avoids coming across as being elitist?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the view here about education and the system is one that we are not going to break down the barriers between Democrats and Republicans. But what we need to focus on more is what's the system for. And I think you can achieve some very wide consensus. And in fact, in the current environment in the world that we live in, education is for producing this new cadre, this new generation of human workers that can power our economy, strengthen our democracy, improve our social well-being. So I think that we need to focus on the diversity of the system. And what we've been talking about today is the diversity of the institutions, the providers, the ways in which you can gain these high quality credentials, and at the same time make sure that you have access to those kind of learning institutions over the course of your lifetime. These pathways that we've been talking about, starting with short-term credentials, continuing on with bachelor's degrees and beyond, is very important. My view is that the consensus is less on this institution or this policy or that policy, but on the outcomes. The outcome being a more talented society, the outcome being more equity and justice for all, and the outcome being that at the end of the day, our collective well-being is going to rest on the success, not just of me as an individual, but of all of us as a society. And I think if we focus on those issues of the collective well-being, on the shared prosperity, we will overcome some of these political divisions that we've seen. Different states will have different approaches, different models for how they execute on that. I think we should honor that. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach to this. But at the end of the day, the goals do need to be similar. The goals do need to be a more talented society, focusing on equity and justice as core parts of the system, and ensuring that people have the pathways to these learning opportunities, both in the traditional sense, but also over the course of their entire adult human work lifetime. To me, that would be a more bipartisan or nonpartisan approach to the system than what we have today.
Great closing to a really fabulous session with you all. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's wonderful, I think, for me to help moderate this, but also for our colleagues in the field to see your passion and your insight around this work, and really appreciate your time today joining us. We're going to turn now to the next session. But before we do that, I want to thank our convenings team. This is, as most of us know here at Lumina, kind of the first pancake of doing a virtual retreat, and we hope that it turns out well. We've worked well with our convenings team, Domi, Molly, and Michelle, to make sure that this is seamless for you all, and want to thank you all for your participation. And we could not have gotten to this point without our convenings team stepping up and leading this charge. I'm now going to hand it off to Amanda De La Rosa on the State Policy team, and she is going to lead us into the rest of the day in the next session. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your retreat.
Good morning, and thanks for joining Lumina Foundation's virtual state policy retreat. I'm Amanda De La Rosa, Strategy Officer for State Policy at the Foundation, and I get to serve as our conference MC. This year, we're focused on bringing you content that sparks a shift in your state. We're here to help you plan for a more equitable future. We're 5 years out from Goal 2025, and in these unprecedented times of challenge and opportunity, we know that state leadership, particularly on racial equity and quality attainment, can be the difference between communities thriving or folding under pressure. Each of you has something meaningful to contribute to the work ahead. If you're participating in the retreat as one of 20 state teams, Through the conference platform, you will have access to afternoon workshops, designated team time for state planning, and networking. Please explore the feature in the reception that allows you to connect with fellow conference goers spontaneously too. We invite all of our participants, whether you're on a team or not, to listen in to our short on-demand policy spotlights available in the Expo section of the conference platform. In the reception tab, you'll also find the full agenda for the retreat and other content-related resources. With all that you have going on, we appreciate that you've chosen to spend some time with us. Don't forget to take breaks and engage in our sessions through the chat feature and on social media. If you need technical support at any point, you can direct questions to Lumina admin via the chat feature on the right side of your screen. Up next, we've carved out some time for you to explore the policy spotlights in the expo, and then state teams will come back together for our afternoon workshop. We'll welcome back our public audience tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you to our esteemed morning panel and to each of you for being with us. We'll meet you in the sessions room in 30 minutes.